Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by GetAroundCaboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am super delighted because Todd Litman said yes when I said, would you like to come onto the podcast? I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. Todd, whereabouts are you calling from, and what made you interested in this whole area?
I'm located in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. It's a beautiful small city. It happens to be our provincial capital. There is frequent confusion over Victoria, Canada and Victoria, Australia. So sometimes people contact me and they think that I'm Australian. I have spent my career looking at innovative solutions to transportation problems. When I was in college, I was relying on bicycle transportation, and I became very interested in the big picture questions related to bicycle and, you could say, sustainable mode transportation, how to get around without having to drive everywhere. And that motivated me. I spent a decade managing a bike shop, so that was very practical, but I also became a community bicycle advocate. Through my local work, that led me to become a state bicycle lobbyist in Washington State in the US. I was spending a lot of time trying to explain to transportation professionals and policymakers why bicycling deserved a bigger share of the pie. That motivated me to go back and get a master's degree that really looked in depth at the full costs of automobile transportation, and therefore the full benefits that result if people are able to drive less and spend less money on their vehicles and on the roadway infrastructure and rely more on walking and bicycling and public transit and other options. And so this has been professional development, but it's also been personal because for much of my life, we have not owned a car. And I know from personal experience what it's like to try and get around without a car and to be responsible for children and pets. How do you get around with a big noisy dog if you don't have a car? Fortunately, over the 35, 40 years that I've been working on this, there's been a lot of progress. So I'm really, in some ways, excited, but I am also continually frustrated that we haven't made more progress because there's so much inertia in the system. So my research continues to look at what are the benefits of a more efficient and diverse transportation system and more walkable communities and all of the associated decision-making.
I share so much of what you're saying, because that's why I started Get Around Caboolture. It was because how do you get around Caboolture without having to drive everywhere? Because I don't actually have a car. Oh, this is terrible, this bus service. So what is it that really matters to you in your work?
There are many facets to transportation. Transportation affects our lives in countless ways, in ways that are associated with our behavior, our experience, our economics, our health, our livelihoods, our economic opportunities, all of these. A lot of people have worked very hard in order to afford a car. They've seen a lot of advertisements that make driving seem exciting and fun and encourage them to lead an automobile-dependent lifestyle. And so a lot of people are frightened by the idea of reducing car travel. They say, that would be good for the environment, but it would be bad for me. And I like to turn that around. I think we can invert the issue and point out the many benefits of leading a less automobile-dependent lifestyle and relying more on what you could call the affordable modes or the healthy modes or the relaxing modes, depending on which audience you're talking about or how you're framing the issue. From my personal experience and from my research, I can show that for many people, their lives are going to be better if they drive less and rely more on non-auto modes. Can you think of anything more ironic than people driving to a gym so they can sit around in a stuffy room with a lot of sweaty people pedaling on a stationary bicycle, and they're paying at both ends. They're paying for the car trip and the parking space that they have to use to drive to the gym, and they're paying all that money to pedal that stationary bicycle. Where if they lived in a very walkable, bikeable community, their ability to bicycle, their desire to bicycle would actually be a financial savings rather than a cost. And you can look at many other examples where the automobile-dependent transportation system results in people doing irrational, inefficient, and unfair travel behaviors, like driving to a gym to exercise or chauffeuring their kids to school, even though the kids would be much happier. They would be free-range kids. Let me ask you this. Do you ever pay extra for an egg laid by a free-range chicken?
It's true. Like, free range is a commodity, actually. It's like a high status thing, it turns out.
Exactly. So you're paying extra. So your chickens that are laying your eggs are free-range. Shouldn't we be willing to pay a little extra so our children can be free-range and get all that health and enjoyment and independence? Another example of the inefficiency of our current transportation system is all that time that parents spend chauffeuring kids around. And one of the studies I do, I look at the research on the cost of traffic congestion. So think about all the time that motorists waste sitting in traffic congestion. And there are various studies that have quantified this. They put a dollar value on it. And one of the studies I did, it asked, how much time are people spending chauffeuring their loved ones in a community that lacks good walking and bicycling and public transit? So you're in an automobile-dependent community, and you want to be a responsible parent or a responsible child to your elderly parents. And so you could easily be spending 10 or 20% of your travel is chauffeuring people, your loved ones, who actually want to be able to travel independently. They just lack suitable options. And so think about the reduction in travel time, driving time, and travel expenses, and the external costs like traffic congestion and accident risk and pollution that all that driving imposes, which is avoidable and makes everybody happier if we live in a community where non-drivers have a reasonable degree of independent mobility. If you talk with most 10 to 14-year-olds, do they want to be chauffeured by their parents? Not usually. Occasionally it's nice and we have a good conversation. But for the most part, that's the age where they're striving for independence, not to mention a little bit of physical activity rather than being strapped into the back seat of a car. I'm giving a couple examples. We could go into far greater detail of all the situations where people, you could say travelers, would be better off if they had better non-auto mobility options, so they just didn't have to spend as much time and money and effort and loss of independence from relying only on automobile travel.
I wanted to get you on to talk about the mobility productivity paradox. So I've known about your work since I started GetAroundCaboolture a few years ago now, and your name kept coming up on the professional social media platform. And I've seen quite a few papers. They're always top shelf. They're fantastic. But I must say the mobility productivity paradox is the one where I go, that's my fave. And that's the one that I use most in advocacy, because we can't imagine that driving reduces productivity, because all the assumptions that road building has in the transport modeling is all about how cars increase productivity.
So this is one of many studies. It's available free on my website. Earlier versions of it were peer-reviewed technical papers at conferences. So it is, I believe, a reliable, credible publication. What it does is it compares this thing called economic productivity, per capita gross domestic product, for various cities and states based on their transportation system. And the conventional thinking that's been assumed for most of the last century is that when people go from non-auto modes, think of a very traditional community where people literally carry loads on their head or on their shoulders, or horse-drawn wagons, or bicycles, or ferries, or human-drawn ferries. The very old transportation systems, they were, you could say, technically inefficient. They required a lot of effort to transport a person or an object. And so it made sense that, let's say, between 1900, when almost nobody had a car, to, let's say, 1930s, when the transportation system became much more automobile-oriented and there were buses and trucks and more people had cars, that there was a positive effect that this motorized transportation increased productivity. Think of a trades worker, a carpenter, or a painter, or an electrician. If they tried to get around without a motor vehicle, they would have to carry all of these tools and parts and everything on their back or whatever, and they wouldn't be nearly as productive as when they got that vehicle and started carrying their tools more efficiently. As automobile dependency became more common, the distances that people have to travel increased, so the whole system became less efficient. And we started using motor vehicles for less productive uses. For example, a carpenter becomes more efficient if they have a nice little work vehicle. But somebody who's commuting from a suburb to their office downtown, there's no increase in productivity if they drive rather than take the bus or bicycle. In fact, the greatest efficiency is if you live in a walkable neighborhood where you don't need to even take a bus, where you're able to walk to run most errands and maybe bicycle to your office, or you work at home. And there's a huge efficiency gain from those. And so what my research shows is that beyond an optimal level, which is about a quarter of the amount of driving people engaged in right now, more driving is associated with reduced economic productivity. Economic productivity tends to peak at about 5,000 to 8,000 vehicle kilometers per capita, which represents a typical multimodal community where people walk and bike for local errands. They use public transit when they're driving along a busy urban corridor. They only use an automobile for those trips where they are truly the most efficient options. For example, if you're going on holiday and you want a caravan, there's an efficiency there. And if you're taking your family, maybe mom, dad, kids, a couple grandparents out to a picnic, that's where automobiles are very efficient. But if you need to drive to transport one person from a home to a job, and that requires a motor vehicle, all that road space, a parking space at the destination, and incurs all that risk. If every time you take a trip, even if it's just a local errand to, say, take your children to school, if you're forced to drive, that's inefficient. My research reveals those inefficiencies, the fact that we are losing if we are forced to drive for trips where other modes would be more efficient overall. The study I did, it looks at the outcomes, which is reduced economic productivity in more automobile-dependent areas, and it examines why that would be. What are the additional costs when you go from a multimodal transportation system where you only use your car for a portion of trips to an automobile-dependent transportation system where you're forced to drive pretty much every trip? What are the inefficiencies? And so my study actually details these inefficiencies.
I've been thinking a lot about women's trips in the suburbs. Most of the transport data that I've seen is about the commute, because it's a nice, easy one. You start at home and you get to an office. That's the lowest hanging fruit. And I could understand that people would study that when you didn't have the same computational power, when women's lives were deemed not worth studying. But today, my understanding is about 6 in 10 trips is actually close to home. It's women's trips. It's to the shops. It's to the school. It's taking somebody to a medical appointment. I'm wondering how we can focus on those more suburban, close to home trips to increase productivity, so to speak. And maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree, but I think that these close to home suburban trips that women do are the low-hanging fruit for improving our transport system. Would the mobility productivity paradox be a good model to understand that? Have I misunderstood your thesis?
It absolutely does apply. Now, I would respectfully disagree on one point, and that is that it's best to frame it in terms of men versus women. In my research on evaluating transportation equity, I emphasize that it's tempting to evaluate people based on categories like men versus women, or blacks versus white, or young people versus old people. But it's actually more accurate to categorize us by function, which is, do you own a car and do you have a driver's license versus people who don't? Or are you wealthy enough that you can easily afford the cost burdens of a car? Or are you lower income or financially constrained? And so even if you own a car, you're spending way more than your budget really allows. You're spending too much money on your car, and so you can't afford to help your children with their education, or you can't afford healthcare services, or you can't afford healthy food. I totally agree with your point, which is that our transportation system does not serve a lot of people's needs. It does not serve a lot of travel demands because it's automobile oriented. And that's particularly true in the suburbs. In the more recent urban fringe development is very automobile oriented. And it's also true that probably most of the people who bear those disadvantages are young people, mothers or caregivers, and seniors who are losing their ability to drive. Those are certainly categories of people who are more likely to be burdened by automobile dependency. But keep in mind, this is not men versus women, because there are plenty of men who suffer from this. And there's plenty of women who benefit from automobile dependency. Either maybe some of them would actually prefer something different, but they've just got sucked into it. And they're proud of their sports car. They're proud of being able to afford a ute or whatever. Okay, I can see politically it's useful to categorize people because you can think of them as voting blocks. But if we're trying to do transportation planning, we want to categorize people by their mobility ability. And that's where it's worth pointing out that there are plenty of men who are burdened by the lack of mobility options, especially if they're caregivers and they're located in an automobile dependent area. We can invert that and talk about the benefits that result to the mom and dad or whoever it is that's taking care of young people if that family can locate in a walkable, bikeable neighborhood. And so actually one of my favorite performance indicators now is walk score. There's walk score heat maps. You can actually look at how a neighborhood rates in terms of walk score, most urban areas in the world. And it's actually a really interesting indicator because it doesn't actually measure walkability. It doesn't measure whether there's a sidewalk or a crosswalk or whether it's safe to cross the street. It measures proximity, the distance between your home and common destinations like schools and shops. And it can be modified to include things like parks. And so you would say it's an indicator of accessibility. And the striking thing about the suburbs, pretty much any urban fringe neighborhood that was built after 1950, almost all of them have very poor walkability. A lot of the streets have no sidewalks at all, and they're not complete communities. You wouldn't allow a youth that is somebody under, let's say, 15 years old, just to walk to the local store because there are so many busy streets that lack sidewalk. I like to frame this in the most positive way. And what I would point out is that there are an awful lot of neighborhoods that are automobile dependent, and those neighborhoods would be a better place to live. They would be more livable. And the residents there would have lower financial burdens and more independence and be healthier. They could significantly increase their walk score. It's a benefit to everybody. The parents aren't having to waste time chauffeuring kids. Some households can go from owning 2 cars to 1 car or 0 cars. If you want to age in place, let me ask you this. Do you aspire to grow old?
Yes.
Of course, you hope that your older self in 10 or 20 or 30 years is going to be healthy and wealthy? And do you want to stay in your existing neighborhood? Would you prefer that your older self be able to stay?
I would like to. I don't necessarily want to stay in this house because it's so big, but I would prefer a small one, but there's no choice around here.
Okay, so we're getting to the point is a lot of people, they want to stay in their neighborhood so that they can maintain their friendships and keep going to the same pub or church or synagogue or whatever, and maintain their social relationships. And a lot of people, they think, oh, I plan to keep driving until I die. But there's always a chance that your future self will be either unable to drive or unable to afford a car and will want to get around through non-auto modes. So there's a chance that making your community more walkable and bikeable and transit friendly and making sure that there are neighborhood services, that is actually your own self-interest. You're not just being generous to your neighbors who can't drive, you're also preparing for your future self. And so there is a very strong justification for people like you and me to be advocating for better walking and bicycling and public transit service in our neighborhoods to prepare for our future self. Now, that future, that crisis that eliminates your ability to drive or afford a car could occur tomorrow. You could slip on some pavement or something, or be attacked by a wallaby or something that means that somebody who's accustomed to leading an automobile-dependent lifestyle suddenly can't do that. And there is a very strong justification for suburbs to become more multimodal. So there's a movement among planners. One of the terms is called sprawl repair. And it's recognizing that a lot of the urban infrastructure right now is sprawled and automobile dependent, but that can change. We could recreate the complete communities that used to be so common. Probably your grandparents had a house in a walkable neighborhood that had a sidewalk along the street, and your parents would probably be able to walk to school. Is that true?
My grandparents grew up in India with servants, so that's not a great example.
Okay. The average family in the 1950s and 60s in Australia, most probably was located either out in the bush, or if they were in a town, it was a walkable town or a walkable urban neighborhood, and the kids could walk to school. That was probably very common. But in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, we forgot how important it is to have that walkability. One of the ways we're discovering it now is that in most developed countries, about 20% of households have a pet. Do you have a pet?
Yeah, she's just asleep next to me.
One of the most common reasons that people go for a walk is to walk their dogs. At least 20%, and probably more, of households in my neighborhood, it is very important to be able to walk their dog. So should we make sure that neighborhoods are canine friendly, that our neighborhood is a safe place to walk a dog? Is that a good planning goal? Do you think a lot of people would buy into that, would vote in favor of better dog walking conditions?
So we had Jennifer Kent actually ages ago, and she did some research which showed that a huge number of local trips are just to put the dog in the car to drive to the dog park to let the dog out. Speaking to your problem that people want to be able to take their dog for a walk, but they have to do it through the car first because of the way that our societies are designed.
Exactly. So in an automobile-dependent area, pets, children, your seniors, or anybody that can't drive becomes freight to be transported from point A to point B. And okay, a modern car is pretty comfortable and you can crank up the sound system and maybe enjoy some music and have a conversation. So it's not terrible, but there are a lot of situations where walking would be more pleasant, especially if we have really well-designed pedestrian and bicycle facilities. Walking and bicycling can be extremely pleasant. One of my recent studies is looking at how we can design pedestrian networks to deal with extreme heat. Here in Canada, we have to deal with extreme cold, and there are some communities where 6 months of the year, it's difficult to walk because of snow and ice. And in Australia, there's going to be several months of the year where it's too hot. Both of those problems can be addressed with good planning. And what we find is that walking and bicycling mode share, that is the portion of trips made by active modes, is often higher in extreme climate conditions, because the worst thing you can do in extreme cold or extreme heat is to try and get in your car and drive it. The car is extremely hot or stuffy or extremely cold and frozen up. And extreme weather is not an excuse to stop planning for active transportation. It just requires a somewhat different approach. When you consider the benefits that Australia and other hot climate countries could do an awful lot for what I call cool walkability planning.
If we've got somebody not in a position of power, maybe a mum with a couple of small kids, somebody with chronic pain. These are people who listen to our podcast, who support us, who don't have money, who don't have time, who don't have power, who just have their own resources. So what's something they could do? And if somebody's at the bottom of the food chain at council, they also feel frustrated by the system, they want to make change, but they really don't know how to do it. What are some things that you suggest that they can do in order to shift the problem of the mobility productivity paradox?
There are many good reasons to create communities that are more walkable and bikeable and transit oriented. I think a starting point is to become familiar with all the benefits of walkability and to be able to say to your city council or your traffic engineer or other decision makers, we just aren't investing enough in sidewalks and crosswalks. Who could argue against improving walkability in your neighborhood? Here's the root of the challenge. Governments have dedicated money for highways, and it is normal in most communities to require property owners to provide off-street parking spaces. So if you build a house, you're required to have a garage. And if you're building an office building, you're required to have this giant parking lot. And that's all in the zoning code. And that is basically the government spending somebody else's money. They're forcing the property owner to subsidize parking spaces. There's huge money going into building highways and subsidizing parking. We're talking about using North American data. Every time somebody buys a car, they're expecting the government to spend about $1,000 a year to build roads and provide traffic services like traffic law enforcement. And they're expecting businesses to spend about $2,000 to $4,000 a year to subsidize parking for their use. So every time you go to a pub and buy a beer, a few cents of the price of that beer is to subsidize the parking space for those pub employees and pub customers who drive there. Even if I walk or bicycle or take public transit to get to the pub, I'm subsidizing the parking for those people who drive. Okay, so we're spending literally hundreds or even a few $1,000s a year on infrastructure for each car. In order to go from basic sidewalks, the quality of sidewalks in a typical community now, to very high quality sidewalks and bikeways, the local government needs to double or triple the amount of money they're spending on sidewalks and bikeways. Okay, that means going from about $50 a year to about $100 a year or even $150 a year. Now that seems like a lot of money, a huge increase. If you go to your local traffic engineer or you go to your city councilor and you say, I want to double or triple the amount of money we're spending on sidewalks, that seems like a lot of money because the baseline is so low. But when you compare it with what we're spending on roads for cars and parking spaces subsidies, and what households are spending to own and operate cars, it's tiny. We're talking about $50 to $100 a year per capita, where the typical household is spending somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year on cars and roads and parking subsidies. It's less than 1%. So there is every logical reason to say that if improving walking and bicycling facilities will allow some households to reduce the amount that they're spending on cars and reduce the amount that we have to spend on parking subsidies, it's a strong economic case. And it's also a social equity case. Why should I, somebody that doesn't own a car, be forced to subsidize parking spaces for my neighbors who might own 2 or 3 or 4 cars in their household? It is simply unfair. There are ways, if you're a resident of your town and you go to city council and you say, wait a second, we're spending far more on infrastructure for somebody who drives than we're spending on people who walk and bike and their dogs. We're not fully serving the demands for all those dogs that want to be walked. Shouldn't we have a plan to improve the quality of sidewalks and crosswalks and bikeways, at least so that people who depend on those modes get their fair share? So I think that there's a fairness issue. You can talk about the cost savings to governments if people drive less and don't need as much road space and as many parking facilities. You can talk about savings to households and reduced time wasted by drivers when they're making those chauffeuring trips that they don't want to make. There are numerous ways that we can show that it is perfectly reasonable to shift some of this road space and some of the money that we're currently devoting just to car use and make it more multimodal.
So we're just about to wrap up. Is there anything you would like to share? Any final remarks?
Let me give a couple ideas. One of the most effective initial strategies is for local governments to simply eliminate off-street parking mandates, because this current system assumes that everybody drives everywhere. And so it is okay to force people that don't own a car to subsidize the parking spaces for people who do. But obviously that's not true. In any community, there's some people who don't drive, or households where there's 1 car for 2 or 3 adults. There's a really good case for parking policy reforms. That is one of the real opportunities. Another strategy, which is a different way to think about this, is that anybody involved in transportation decision-making should spend at least 1 day, maybe 2 or 3 days out of the year, relying on a wheelchair, being required to travel around their community without being able to drive and without being able to walk, to experience what it is like to try and satisfy their normal daily needs in a wheelchair. And one of the things most people will discover is that even where there are sidewalks, the sidewalks have gaps. So you will see various degrees. There's plenty of streets that have no sidewalk at all, and somebody in a wheelchair is forced to travel in the street itself. There's essentially no facilities at all. Or there could be a sidewalk, but there's no ramps. So you're forced to be in the street, travel in the street simply because you can't get those few centimeters from the street level up to the sidewalk. In other cases, you'll find the sidewalk is too narrow. Yeah, you can go along for a while and then you hit a telephone pole or a bench or some crack that narrows the sidewalk. It's a major barrier. And then you'll experience what it's like to try and get a wheelchair into a taxi, or try and get on a bus with a wheelchair, or try and go through a ferry terminal or bus terminal. And usually that is pretty bad. So it's a reminder that even if you have 95% of the system fully accommodating, it's those little gaps that really are the barrier. I use wheelchairs as what a traffic engineer would call the design vehicle. We're going to guarantee that wheelchairs can operate efficiently in this building or on the sidewalk. But the truth is there are far more users of those facilities than just wheelchairs. Parents pushing a stroller also need good wide sidewalks with ramps and other accommodations. Or all those tourists that are arriving in town with wheeled luggage, or those busy business people with giant wheeled briefcases, or your delivery driver who's pushing a hand cart. I want to emphasize that designing communities for wheelchairs is not just for wheelchair users. It's a design standard that accommodates a wide range of users, including probably you and me, when we're trying to get around your community.
That's fantastic. There's so much there, and I have learnt so much. It's time to wrap up. Unfortunately, I would love to keep the conversation going, but productivity. I just want to say thank you very much for coming on, and I know you're completely flat chat, and it's really delightful that you made time to come on today. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out GetAroundCaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.